Paris is a city born of firelight and fury. Centuries of relentless ambition are carved into its narrow medieval alleys and grand boulevards, built by kings, torn apart by revolutionaries, and reimagined by artists and rebels time and time again. Through plagues, occupations, and total war, the fiercely proud Parisians have carried a single defining trait: an absolute refusal to be silenced. Every barricade raised, every masterpiece painted, and every whispered radical idea here has fundamentally shifted the course of world history. Before Paris became the metropolis we know today, it was merely a scatter of mud huts on a river island. Around 259 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled on what is now the Ile de la Cité, fishermen and traders controlling a strategic river crossing. Interestingly, it was these ancient Gauls who first invented a precursor to soap, a paste made of goat fat and beech ash used for cleansing. They weren't building grand monuments, they were simply, Paris is a city born of firelight and fury. Centuries of relentless ambition are carved into its narrow medieval alleys and grand boulevards, built by kings, torn apart by revolutionaries, and reimagined by artists and rebels time and time again. Through plagues, occupations, and total war, the fiercely proud Parisians have carried a single defining trait: an absolute refusal to be silenced. Every barricade raised, every masterpiece painted, and every whispered radical idea here has fundamentally shifted the course of world history. Before Paris became the metropolis we know today, it was merely a scatter of mud huts on a river island. Around 259 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled on what is now the Ile de la Cité, fishermen and traders controlling a strategic river crossing. Interestingly, it was these ancient Gauls who first invented a precursor to soap, a paste made of goat fat and beech ash used for cleansing. They weren't building grand monuments, they were simply fighting to survive. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar arrived. The Romans did not ask for permission. During the Gallic Wars, the original settlement was burned to the ground, but Rome rebuilt it with trademark imperial efficiency. They named it Lutetia, meaning the marshy place. On the left bank of the Seine, a proper Roman town flourished, complete with a 15,000-seat amphitheater, public baths, and temples. The Roman peace seemed eternal, but by the 3rd century, Germanic raids forced the residents to retreat behind the fortified stone walls of the Ile de la Cité. The 5th century brought absolute chaos as the Roman Empire collapsed. Attila the Hun and his armies marched directly toward Lutetia, prompting terrified residents to flee. It was then that a young woman named Genevieve stepped forward, convincing the population to stay and pray rather than abandon their homes. Miraculously, Attila's forces changed course, sparing the town. Whether down to divine intervention or calculated military strategy, Paris survived and gained its patron saint. By 508 AD, Clovis I, king of the Franks, established the city as his capital, naming it Paris after the ancient tribe. French history is filled with such fascinating dynastic anomalies. For instance, John I was proclaimed king while still in his mother's womb, becoming the youngest monarch in history, though he lived for only 5 days. 3 centuries later, a new terror sailed up the river. Viking raiders targeted the city's wealth. In 845 AD, Paris bought them off with 7,000 pounds of silver, more an act of extortion than a victory. The most brutal siege came in 885 AD, when a few hundred defenders held the fortified bridges for months against thousands of Norsemen. Paris endured, learning a vital medieval lesson. To survive, you must build impenetrable walls. During the 12th and 13th centuries, emerged as a true global powerhouse. In 1163, construction began on Notre Dame Cathedral. The economy of this monumental project relied on brutal underground labor, as the limestone was quarried from deep tunnels directly beneath the left bank. The Gothic masterpiece defied gravity with its flying buttresses and soaring vaults. Simultaneously, the University of Paris took shape, establishing the left bank as the intellectual capital of Europe. Scholars and students spoke exclusively in Latin, giving the Latin Quarter its name. King Philip II paved the muddy streets with stone and constructed the Louvre, not the museum we know today, but a grim fortress designed to protect the royal treasury. By 1300, the population exploded to 200,000, its economy driven by nearly 180 Italian banking houses, establishing operations here. Yet, wealth invited catastrophe. The 14th century nearly brought Paris to its knees. First came the Great Famine of the 1310s, followed by the generational brutality of the Hundred Years' War. Then, in 1348, the Black Death arrived. The pneumonic and bubonic plague wiped out half the population, leaving the stench of decay over the city for years. Bloody peasant and worker uprisings erupted in the chaos. By 1420, Paris fell under English occupation for 16 years. The turning point arrived with a 17-year-old peasant girl, Joan of Arc, who rallied the exhausted French forces. Though her direct assault on Paris failed and she was ultimately burned at the stake, the momentum had shifted. In 1436, Paris was finally liberated. The 16th century brought the elegance of the Italian Renaissance to France. Francis I transformed the Louvre into a magnificent palace and invited Leonardo da Vinci to spend his final years here. Yet beneath this cultural sophistication, a dark religious schism was brewing between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. On August 24, 1572, tensions erupted into the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. What began as a targeted assassination of Protestant leaders spiraled into a citywide slaughter. Catholic mobs hunted citizens in the streets, and the Seine choked on bodies. Thousands died in Paris, and tens of thousands nationwide. To end the Civil War, King Henry IV famously converted to Catholicism, declaring that Paris is well worth a mass. He began the healing process, commissioning the Pont Neuf, the city's oldest surviving bridge, and the elegant Place des Vosges, setting the stage for absolute monarchy. The 17th century was defined by imperial grandeur. By order of Louis XIV, Paris became one of the first European cities to implement large-scale street lighting to curb crime. Around the same time, the world's first structured public transport system was launched here using multi-passenger horse-drawn carriages. Louis XIV, the Sun King, turned monarchy into an absolute art form. He redesigned Paris but made the radical decision to move his court to Versailles in 1682, deeply distrusting the volatile Parisian populace. While Versailles became the political nucleus, Paris remained the cultural heart of Europe. In its elite salons, philosophers and writers dictated the trends of fashion, gastronomy, and etiquette copied across the continent. Ironically, Paris was cemented as the capital of haute couture by an outsider, the English designer Charles Worth, who opened the first true fashion house here. By the 18th century, the brilliance of the Enlightenment masked a rotting reality. The population swelled to 600,000, trapped in squalor and medieval sanitation. Overcrowded cemeteries literally poisoned the air, forcing the city to relocate the skeletal remains of 6 million citizens into abandoned limestone quarries. This created the catacombs, a subterranean city of the dead lined with walls of skulls and bones. By the 1780s, France was entirely bankrupt. Taxes crushed the poor while the nobility paid virtually nothing, sending bread prices soaring.
Paris is a city born of firelight and fury. Centuries of relentless ambition are carved into its narrow medieval alleys and grand boulevards. Built by kings, torn apart by revolutionaries, and reimagined by artists and rebels time and time again. Through plagues, occupations, and total war, the fiercely proud Parisians have carried a single defining trait: an absolute refusal to be silenced. Every barricade raised, every masterpiece painted, and every whispered radical idea here has fundamentally shifted the course of world history. Backed by a unified currency, the franc. But his empire collapsed in the frozen wastes of Russia, and by 1814, Paris was occupied by Russian, Prussian, and Austrian forces. The following decades saw a relentless cycle of revolutions in 1830 and 1848, with barricades becoming the trademark of Parisian resistance. During this industrial era, the Caisse d'Épargne opened as France's first savings bank to protect the earnings of ordinary citizens. In 1851, Napoleon's nephew seized power as Emperor Napoleon III and hired Baron Haussmann to completely redesign the city. Haussmann ruthlessly demolished medieval slums to carve out wide, straight boulevards. This was done not just for aesthetics, but for military control. Wide streets were impossible to block with barricades and allowed the rapid deployment of cavalry and artillery. This is the Paris we recognize today. In 1870, a disastrous war with Prussia led to a brutal 4-month siege, forcing starving citizens to consume rats and zoo animals. In March 1871, radical workers declared the Paris Commune. The French government retaliated with the Bloody Week, executing between 10,000 and 20,000 communards. In their final retreat, the rebels torched the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville. Yet from the ashes emerged the Belle Époque, a golden age where Paris became the global capital of art and innovation. The Impressionists captured light, the Moulin Rouge opened, and for the 1889 World's Fair, the Eiffel Tower was erected. Parisian artists initially condemned it as an ugly smokestack. The writer Guy de Maupassant famously ate lunch inside its restaurant every day, simply because it was the only spot in the city where he didn't have to look at it. Yet, it became the ultimate symbol of human ambition. The First World War nearly broke France. In 1914, German forces advanced within 30 miles of the city. In a legendary move, Parisian taxicabs were requisitioned to rush thousands of soldiers to the front line, saving the capital at the Battle of the Marne. Following the war came the Années Folles, the Roaring Twenties. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Picasso made Paris their sanctuary. Coco Chanel revolutionized fashion, liberating women from corsets. But by 1940, darkness returned. The Wehrmacht marched into Paris without a fight, as it was declared an open city to prevent its destruction. For 4 years, the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. Before Hitler's arrival, French resistance fighters cut the tower's elevator cables, forcing the Führer to remain at its base. July 1942 saw the Vel d'Hiv tragedy, the mass arrest and deportation of 13,000 Jews. Remarkably, the Grand Mosque of Paris operated as a clandestine resistance hub during these years, providing Algerian and European Jews with forged Muslim identity papers to save them from concentration camps. The resistance fought a shadow war until August 1944, when citizens rose up, reclaiming their city street by street before Allied forces arrived. Post-war Paris sought meaning in the existentialist philosophy of Sartre and de Beauvoir. The city expanded rapidly, building high-rise suburbs to house its growing population. French law retained unique legal phenomena from this era. To this day, posthumous marriage is legally permissible in France with presidential approval. In May 1968, the Latin Quarter erupted again as student and worker protests paralyzed the country, fundamentally challenging traditional authority and social structures. The late 20th century brought massive architectural feats, the glass Louvre Pyramid and the ultra-modern La Défense district. Fascinatingly, even in modern urban Paris, there are roughly 300 officially registered beehives active on city rooftops, producing record quantities of honey. The 21st century has tested Paris severely, from the devastating terrorist attacks of 2015 to the catastrophic fire that brought down the spire of Notre Dame in 2019. Yet the history of this city proves one undeniable truth: Paris knows how to endure. It has been conquered, burned, occupied, and torn apart by its own people, but it always rises from the ashes. The city that gave the world radical ideals of liberty and human dignity will never stop fighting for its soul.